A widow's secret, a glass of wine, and a killer hiding in plain sight. Welcome to Shadow Files. I am your host, Kale. I love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in. Your words make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's begin. The news of Lady Eleanor Davenham's death travelled swiftly through the drawing rooms of London. By the next morning, the tragedy was whispered over silver teapots in Mayfair, murmured in gentlemen's clubs, and debated in the back pages of the Times. For the police, it was a case already threatening to cause embarrassment. A woman of great wealth and influence, dead in the midst of her guests, and with no clear evidence save a glass of wine. Inspector Jameson had sealed off the house in Belgrave Square, keeping the staff and visitors under discreet observation. Each person was questioned, but his efforts produced only a tangle of contradictions. The butler swore the decanter had not left the room. The lady's companion insisted her mistress had not taken any medicine before the gathering, though Dr. Linton muttered otherwise. Richard Davenham spoke of his aunt with dutiful respect, yet there was an air about him, a kind of calculating watchfulness, that the inspector did not fail to notice. It was into this atmosphere of tension and suppressed fear that Hercule Poirot arrived. His appearance, precise and immaculate as ever, was something of a shock to the assembled household. The little Belgian, faultlessly dressed, with his patent leather shoes gleaming and his moustaches waxed to perfection, seemed almost absurdly out of place in a house darkened by grief. Yet there was a quality in his manner, his quiet composure, the assurance in his small, careful movements, that soon made everyone conscious of his authority. He listened to Jameson's account without interruption, nodding slightly, his eyes darting now and again to the faces of those gathered in the morning room. Poison, the inspector concluded once more, introduced into her glass, and her glass alone. But how, and by whom? That, Monsieur Poirot, is where we require your expertise. Poirot's gaze rested thoughtfully on the decanter of wine, then upon the fragments of the broken glass, carefully preserved. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. The how, it will come. The who, it is hidden in the psychology, the secrets each person carries. Always, my friend, people tell you more than they wish, if one has the patience to listen. He asked then to see the company once more. The nephew, the doctor, the companion, the socialite, the clergyman, and even the servants who had passed silently in and out of the drawing-room. One by one they came forward under his calm gaze, and each felt in that moment as though the little Belgian saw straight past their words into their private thoughts. What struck Poirot most, though he said nothing of it, was the curious mixture of fear and relief that ran through them all. Each seemed horrified by Lady Eleanor's death, yet not one of them seemed altogether surprised. The gathering of suspects had begun, though they scarcely realized they were gathered. The morning had the dull brightness of London after a night of heat, a sky bleached to a pale white, pavements already warm and the faint scent of dust rising from the plane trees in the square. Poirot stood a moment by the drawing-room door and let the room declare itself. The flowers were still fresh. White lilies and pale roses arranged with an exactness that told of a hostess who disliked accidents. The windows were drawn up a few inches at the top for air, the curtains parted evenly, and the furniture set with symmetrical courtesy around the hearth. To the left, the sideboard gleamed, the crystal decanter, its stopper perfectly aligned beside it, 4 champagne flutes in a row with the same infinitesimal spacing, and a plate of almond wafers covered again by a glass dome. There, on the Aubusson carpet, the faint impression where Lady Eleanor had fallen remained as a darker oval, like a shadow unwilling to disperse. A maid had tried to scrub the wine from the weave. The carpet, a proud thing, had taken the insult personally and kept a bruise. "It pleases Madame Davenham," Poirot murmured, "that everything should be in its place. It is a character that does not love the improvisation. He moved his fingertips over the edge of a chair as though reading Braille in the shine of the wood. When such a person dies violently, it is not the disorder that astonishes me. It is that anyone believed they could introduce it into her house and not be observed. Inspector Jameson, notebook ready, shifted with a restless impatience that Poirot found in English policemen both endearing and inconvenient. "You'll want the sequence again, sir." "We will take it slowly," said Poirot. "Not for the record, but for the little grey cells. They need the rhythm, you understand." Harrison, the butler, stood near the sideboard, tall and composed. He had the impersonal dignity of a man who had served wealth for so long that he had developed a kind of immunity. "At 7 o'clock, Madame dined alone," Harrison recited. At 9, the guests arrived. Champagne was served in the drawing-room. Lady Eleanor, as usual of late, took white wine. The decanter had been placed here at 8 in the evening. I uncorked it in the pantry before bringing it in. "Before the arrival of guests," Poirot observed. "Yes, sir. Lady Eleanor preferred to pour for herself. The flutes were for the others." "And the glass of Madame?" Harrison glanced at the tray set back upon the sideboard by the police. "Her ladyship's white wine glass has a gold rim with the initials E.D. The rest of the wine glasses have no rim. A distinction that is personal, and that could be exploited," Poirot said softly. "Who places the glasses out?" "The footman, Robert, sir. Under my instruction." "Who handled the monogrammed glass last?" "I did, sir, when I set it by the chair at the corner of the hearthrug." Lady Eleanor took her seat there. Poirot nodded. He went to the corner indicated, looking down at the faint mark in the carpet, then up at the mantel where a French clock ticked with an officious little fuss. On the mantel, an arrangement of miniature portraits. Sir Henry in his youth, clean-chinned and earnest. Lady Eleanor in ivory satin, her chin slightly lifted. A younger woman with eyes very much like Lady Eleanor's, but set deeper, as if the skull behind them kept its secrets hard. Poirot's gaze rested a fraction longer on that face. "About the conversation," he said. "Was it lively?" "Civil, sir," Harrison replied. Miss Harcourt arrived 9:15, Mr. Richard Davenham just after, Dr. Linton at 25 past, the Reverend Pritchard at 1/2 past. Mrs. Vale was in attendance all evening. And there were no strangers, no quiet visitor ushered in by the back stairs. "We do not receive that way, sir," Harrison said, but there was a flicker of offence, a professional pride stung by the suggestion of laxity that told Poirot it was safe to dismiss the idea. Jameson cleared his throat. The scream came shortly after 10. Lady Eleanor had risen to speak. Some announcement she'd hinted at earlier, we're told. She raised her glass, took a sip, and then down she went. "Some announcement," Poirot repeated. "We will return to that, if you please." He asked then for the company to be brought to him one by one in the library, a room shaded by shelves of sober blue bindings and hung with the portrait of a woman in grey whose mouth had been painted too thin for kindness. Poirot took a chair by the window and arranged himself as if to listen to a sonata. Folded hands, neat knees, chin lifted, eyes alight with courtesy. Margaret Vale came first, moving with the practiced unobtrusiveness of a companion who has learned how to exist in the foreground without ever being seen. Her hands worried a handkerchief in her lap. She set it down with an effort when Poirot's gaze dropped to it. "You have been with Lady Eleanor how long, madame?" 18 years, she said. "Nearly 19 in November. She engaged me after Sir Henry's death." "Ah, alors, the time of grief is a time when affinities are made. You became indispensable to her?" "I hope I was useful." "Useful is not indispensable," Poirot said gently. "But you were loyal. That is a rarer thing." She blinked, and in that blink resentment and affection fought like two cats in a sack. Lady Eleanor was not always easy, but she was just, mostly. She has given generously to charities. She kept me, she kept all of us, when she might have reduced the household. Last night, Poirot asked, before the guests came, how was her mood? Nervous, Margaret said at once. Excited almost. She said there would be a settling of accounts. Those were her words. I thought she meant the hospital wing she promised to endow. And did she receive a letter? Margaret's eyes widened. Yes, late afternoon. She read it in her sitting room and burnt it in the grate. I remarked on the smell. She laughed and said, old things must sometimes be given to the fire. Poirot folded this away in his mind like a note slipped under a blotter. You did not see the signature? No. You went out of the drawing room at any time? Only once, to fetch a shawl. The evening had turned close, but Lady Eleanor disliked a draught. Poirot smiled. Every lady dislikes the draught. Merci, madame. She rose, hesitated. Inspector Jameson thinks it was poison. I cannot... She steadied herself. Sir, she had a horror of sudden death. She would never have taken anything of that kind herself. It is of others we must think, said Poirot, not of Lady Eleanor. When she had gone, Dr. Charles Linton entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed in sick rooms. He wore his success with a tidy, unassuming pride. His hair was iron grey, his nails clean, his glance direct. You were Lady Eleanor's physician, Monsieur le Docteur, said Poirot. Her health was good? She suffered occasional palpitations, Linton said, and a little insomnia. Nothing that would suggest this. I have told the inspector that the death appeared sudden, as with a powerful alkaloid, but I am unwilling to be drawn further without a proper analysis. You recommended sedatives? Poirot asked. Tinctures. A mild sedative. No digitalis, if that is what you are angling at. She had no cardiac disease. Poirot inclined his head. And did you approve of her public enterprises? The hospital. What is it called? The Davenham Wing, Linton said, and a small, involuntary amusement touched his mouth. A monument is the acceptable form of immortality. You were at odds with Lady Eleanor? Poirot asked, kindly as one who discusses the weather. We discussed, Linton said. She enjoyed contradicting me. It made her feel vigorous, I think. Last week she hinted at changing her will in favor of the hospital. She asked me whether a life lived in hardness could be redeemed by a generous end. I said redemption was for the clergy. She laughed. You say this in a manner that does not suggest a joke, Poirot said. I am not sure it was a joke, Linton replied. Good morning. Richard Davenham, when he came, brought with him a faint odor of new leather and cologne. He was handsome in the way of a face that has been approved of since childhood. Approval had left its easy polish. His eyes, however, were watchful. My aunt's death is a tragedy, Monsieur Poirot, he said, seating himself, without being asked. If I can assist your inquiry, you have only to say. Your grief does not overwhelm your efficiency, Poirot observed. Richard smiled a little. I have been educated to act. You inherit, I think. I suppose so. She loved to surprise. It would not astonish me if she left everything to the cat's home. And last night, you left the room? For a telephone call, Richard said. At 10:10. My broker. Ah, money never sleeps, Poirot murmured. Harrison saw you. In the hall? Yes. Poirot allowed a pause to lengthen. You and Lady Eleanor, were you, how do you say, on good terms? She was exacting. I did not always live up to the Davenham standards. And last night she intended an announcement. You had a presentiment? Richard's mouth flattened. She called me that afternoon and suggested I might like to be present. When my aunt suggested, she meant commanded. And if the announcement had been disagreeable? I should have congratulated her with perfect composure, Richard said dryly. That is what is taught at Eton. Vivienne Harcourt drifted in with the grace of a woman for whom rooms part like water. She wore a dress the color of weak tea and pearls that did not try too hard. Her smile was practiced charm. It hovered 2 inches from sincerity. "How terrible, Monsieur Poirot," she murmured. "Poor Eleanor. I can hardly imagine the house without her." "You were good friends?" "We were," she said, then amended. "We were friends of a kind. One cannot be friends without equality, can one?" "You quarreled?" "Once a week at least," Vivian said cheerfully. Then, as if catching herself, she lowered her lashes. "About trifles. Guest lists, the hospital gala. She wished her name on the invitations larger than anyone else's. I told her that kind of grandeur belongs to dead queens." And what did Lady Eleanor reply? She said, "My dear, it is all one makes of it." Vivian's smile slipped for the first time. She did not care to be contradicted. "You left the drawing room?" "For a handkerchief," she said. "Powder room, a minute, 2 at most." I returned and found poor Eleanor with her glass in her hand, ready to play the queen. The queen. She loved a little ceremony. She would raise a glass and make a pronouncement. We all lived in her court, in a way. The Reverend Pritchard arrived last of the principal guests, a spare man whose clerical collar sat upon him like a duty rather than a distinction. He had a scholar's habit of folding into himself, but his eyes were not mild. "Lady Eleanor," he said slowly, "was a woman of spirit. I have known penitents. She was not one. And yet perhaps she wished to balance the account," Poirot suggested. "The hospital wing?" Pritchard inclined his head. "Philanthropy is not repentance, Monsieur Poirot." "You overheard a conversation?" Poirot asked, and when the clergyman hesitated, he added, "We do not ask you to betray the secrets of the confessional." "It was in no confessional," Pritchard said crisply. "Yesterday afternoon in the hall, Mr. Richard was earnest with his aunt. He asked her to reconsider the folly. Her word for his life, he said, was squander. She replied that a squanderer should not manage more wealth. He said he would not be humiliated. She said a Davenham had better be humble than notorious. "And you, Monsieur le Pasteur," Poirot said with a small bow to Anglican sensibilities, "you do not love to repeat scandal, yet you repeat it, because you think it is useful." "I think," Pritchard said, "that Lady Eleanor intended to deprive her nephew for what she called his vices. If she had done so publicly last night, there would be motive enough to poison a queen." When the formal company was done, Poirot asked to see the servants as a group. There was Lily, the parlour-maid with anxious red hands, Robert, the footman, who had the sullen charm of youth, Mrs. Penrith, the housekeeper, competent and impenetrable, and Harrison standing a little apart with the incorruptible posture of his kind. Poirot's questions were different now, softer, almost domestic. Who had arranged the flowers? Lily, under Mrs. Penrith's direction? Who had cleaned the silver? Harrison himself? He trusted no one with the good pieces. Who had dusted the monogrammed glasses? Robert, the day before. "And after you placed the glasses," Poirot asked, "did any guest handle them before the arrival of Lady Eleanor?" "No, sir," Robert said with a sideways glance at Harrison. Well, Mrs. Vale came in to look about. She always does." "To look about?" Poirot asked. "Straightening cushions," Lily put in. "She hates a crease." "Like her mistress," Poirot said gently. "And Miss Harcourt?" "Oh, she was late," Lily said quickly. "She's always late." "Always?" Poirot's eyebrows rose. "It is a habit?" "She likes to arrive when everyone has looked at the door 3 times, Robert said, and then colored under Harrison's disapproval. Poirot thanked them and let the room empty. He remained in the quiet library while the house resumed its subdued occupations. The clock in the drawing-room chimed the quarter. A distant cart in the square rattled the nerves of the silence. Poirot looked at his hands, immaculate in their cuff, and saw in the nails the reflection of a man who loved order and had come into a house where order had been thrown down like a gauntlet. "An announcement," he said aloud to the empty room. "A settling of accounts, a letter burnt, a nephew uneasy, a friend who quarrels with style, a doctor who will not be drawn, a companion who is loyal and afraid, a clergyman who believes in punishment, and a glass that is not like the others." He rose and returned to the drawing-room. With Inspector Jameson's permission, he lifted the monogrammed glass by its stem, examined the rim, and set it down again. He did not, in truth, hope to discover anything. The satisfaction was in the symmetry of the act. His eyes drifted to the mantelpiece and to the small French clock, counting in its fussy way. On the corner of the mantel under the clock's brass foot, there was a thin arc where polish had caught and dried, outlining a circle a little larger than the foot itself. Poirot bent close, then straightened, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said, and smiled as if at a private joke. "Almost nothing." He turned to Jameson. "Mon ami, I beg that no one be permitted to leave the house just yet. If any lawyer calls, you will be kind to him but firm, and you will ask him to be patient. I will also trouble you to obtain for me, if it is possible today, the most recent draft of Lady Eleanor's will from her solicitor, and a word with her banker. We must know what change she intended to announce. For some people, to be deprived of money is like the cold sea touching the heart." "You think it's the will," Jameson said. "I think," Poirot replied, "that people do not kill for wine. They kill for what the wine is about to set in motion." He crossed to the window and looked out into the square where a nursemaid pushed a pram and a terrier tyrannized a pigeon. The world, as always, continued with its amiable indifference. In the reflection of the glass, he saw the room behind him arranged with its severe grace. In such a room, every gesture meant something. Lady Eleanor had understood that. So did whoever had killed her. "Also," Poirot added, almost as an afterthought, "I should like a word with the footman about habits." "Habits, Inspector, are the rails upon which crimes run to their destination." He returned once more to the sideboard and stopped, his gaze caught by the decanter's stopper. Harrison, he remembered, had said he laid it there at 8 o'clock. The stopper's position had the neatness of a man who loved neatness. Yet there was, perhaps, a fraction's turn so small that only a mind delighting in exactness would note it, suggesting that some hand had replaced it later with a different sense of alignment. He dismissed it as unkind to suspect perfection of any human hand for more than a minute at a time. But he did not forget it. In the hall, a bell rang. The front door opened on the polished silence. Poirot heard Harrison's measured murmur, then a different voice, crisp with professional sorrow. A solicitor, perhaps, or the banker. The moment shifted almost imperceptibly, like a curtain stirred by air no one could feel. Poirot, who felt such currents as other men feel draughts, smiled again, very slightly, and prepared to continue his small, precise work. The afternoon settled uneasily over Belgrave Square, as though the houses themselves sensed that one of their number had fallen into scandal. At number 17, the blinds remained half-drawn, the sound of the city muffled as if even traffic ought to show respect. Inside, the atmosphere had thickened with the weight of waiting. Servants moved in slippers, voices sank to whispers, and every door seemed to close with more caution than before. Into this quiet tension, Poirot pursued his next step, as deliberate as the ticking of the little French clock on the mantel. He had asked Inspector Jameson to give him the liberty of conducting interviews at his own pace, without interruption. The inspector, though visibly impatient, had complied. Poirot's manner inspired a curious blend of confidence and irritation. One wanted to trust him, and yet one longed for the bustle of obvious action. Jameson, who preferred footprints, fingerprints, and chemical reports, struggled to accept that the little Belgian found his strongest clues not in dust, but in human expression. Still, the inspector had withdrawn to the study to write up his notes, leaving Poirot alone in the library to summon the suspects in turn for further questioning. The first to be recalled was Margaret Vale. She returned, composed now, her earlier agitation carefully smoothed away, though the effort of control showed in the way her lips pressed together when she sat. Poirot, noting everything, offered her a seat not across from him but beside the window, where the light fell strongly upon her face. "You have been most loyal, mademoiselle," he began gently, folding his hands. "I should like to understand more of your relationship with Lady Eleanor. For 18 years you were at her side. You knew her moods, her pleasures, her hatreds. Tell me then, who among those assembled last night would she have counted as her true friend?" Margaret hesitated. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelves as though seeking safety in spines of leather. "She admired Dr. Linton," she said at last. "Not because she liked him, she did not, but because he would contradict her. Eleanor believed contradiction sharpened her mind. Reverend Pritchard she tolerated, though she mocked him cruelly at times. Vivian she kept near for amusement. As for Mr. Richard," her voice grew faint, "he was family. She valued the name above all things. But trust him." Number Poirot inclined his head. "And you, madame? Did she trust you?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "I knew everything about her daily habits, her medicines, her fears. I knew when she pretended to be generous and when she truly was. She said once that I was her shadow. A woman cannot do without her shadow, can she?" Poirot's eyes rested on her, sharp yet not unkind. Sometimes shadows grow impatient of following. She stiffened, and for a heartbeat something fierce and wounded flickered across her face. Then she rose. "I will not be suspected, Monsieur Poirot. I had nothing to gain by her death." "Perhaps nothing," he murmured. "Perhaps everything. We shall see. Merci, madame." When she had gone, he summoned Richard Davenham. The young man entered briskly, his manner confident, but Poirot noticed the way his eyes darted quickly around the room, searching, measuring. He leaned against the mantel rather than sit, affecting nonchalance, but his fingers tapped restlessly at the carved edge. "You are impatient, monsieur," Poirot observed. "You wish this business finished quickly." "Who would not? My aunt's death is a tragedy, but keeping us penned here, cross-examined like criminals, surely it is unnecessary. The will can be examined, and that will answer everything." "Ah, the will," Poirot repeated softly. "You speak of it often. You expect to benefit?" Richard gave a short laugh. "It is hardly mercenary to admit the obvious. I am the last of the Davenhams. Who else should inherit?" Poirot's mustaches twitched, and yet Lady Eleanor hinted that she might make a grand gesture. Philanthropy, perhaps. She had threatened as much, Richard admitted. But it was theatre. She loved to terrify me with talk of hospitals and orphans. She thrived on power, and what greater power than dangling fortune above one's heir? But she would never have truly disinherited me. Not entirely. You sound certain. "I knew my aunt," Richard said firmly. "She wanted me humbled, not ruined. She was too proud of the family name to let it die with her." Poirot looked at him with a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "And last night, when she prepared to make her announcement, you did not fear?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I feared humiliation, yes. Not ruin." He left, his composure intact, though Poirot noted the whitened knuckles as he closed the door behind him. Vivienne Harcourt was next. She swept in as if arriving at a luncheon, her perfume preceding her in a delicate cloud. She chose the most flattering chair, turned her face slightly to the light, and smiled at Poirot with a charm that seemed rehearsed. "Monsieur, surely you do not suspect me. Eleanor and I quarrelled, yes, but always with love." Poirot bowed. "Madame, the quarrels of friends are often more dangerous than the quarrels of enemies. Tell me, why did you come late last night?" Her eyebrows arched. "I am always late. It is my signature. Eleanor used to say I treated her evenings like a stage, and perhaps she was right, but last night, I confess, I delayed on purpose. I thought she meant to humiliate Richard. I did not care to watch. You knew of her intention. She hinted to me. Oh, she could never resist an audience. She told me she would at last clear the air and that Richard would learn his place. That is why I came late. I preferred the scene to be nearly over. Did you love Lady Eleanor? Poirot asked abruptly. Vivian faltered. Her smile slipped. I admired her. She was magnificent, in her way. But love? Number, she was not lovable. One admired, one envied, one endured. Merci, madame, said Poirot. You have the clarity of expression. When she departed, Reverend Pritchard was called. He entered quietly, his hands folded, his expression grave. He took the chair without invitation and regarded Poirot steadily. Lady Eleanor was not a godly woman, he said at once. She enjoyed provoking me with irreverence. Yet I pitied her. A soul so proud cannot but be troubled. You believe she intended to change her will? Yes, she told me herself. She said she wished her wealth to serve the poor, not a wastrel. She did not mention Richard's name, but the implication was plain. I counseled her that charity cannot buy salvation, but she laughed. Still, she meant it. You are certain? Quite. I have no doubt she would have announced it last night, and for that reason, Monsieur Poirot, I believe she was killed. Poirot watched him keenly. And you, monsieur, what did you feel? Relief? Anger? Pritchard's gaze did not waver. I felt sorrow for a soul unrepentant. That is all. Poirot allowed the silence to grow heavy before dismissing him. At last, Dr. Linton returned for a second interview. He looked weary now, as though the weight of suspicion pressed upon him. You were Lady Eleanor's physician, Poirot said. You prescribed her medicine. Might not poison have been introduced under that cover? Linton frowned. Impossible. I keep my own dispensary. No one could have tampered with it. And besides, the symptoms were not those of her regular drugs. It was sudden, violent, too quick for any ordinary sedative. Then what do you think, Doctor? I think someone introduced a powerful toxin directly into her glass, something rare, strychnine perhaps, or aconitine, but I cannot be precise without analysis. Poirot nodded. And the motive? Linton hesitated, then said, Money. Always money. Though Eleanor could be cruel, no one hated her enough to kill for spite alone. When he was gone, Poirot sat in the stillness, his eyes closed, his fingers steepled. He let the words of each suspect flow through his mind, arranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. Margaret with her loyalty tinged with resentment, Richard with his brittle confidence and talk of inheritance, Vivian with her envy and calculated charm, Pritchard with his moral severity, Linton with his cool detachment. Each had a reason. Each had the opportunity. At length, Poirot rose and returned once more to the drawing-room. The monogrammed glass sat in its evidence box, mocking in its silence. He studied it, then the decanter, then the sideboard itself. Something continued to nag at him. Not the obvious, but the subtle. The smallest shift of a stopper, the faintest smudge on polished wood, the alignment of objects so precise that any deviation must mean something. Human nature, he whispered. Always it is human nature. Inspector Jameson entered just then, his face flushed from writing. Well, Poirot, any progress? Poirot turned, smiling faintly. Progress, yes. But certainty, no. We are at the stage, mon ami, where all appears equal. Each person has a motive, each person a possibility. The trick is to see not who could have done it, but who, by their nature, would have done it. Jameson sighed. You make it sound like philosophy. I prefer facts. Then gather your facts, said Poirot serenely. Obtain the will, the banker's records, and any letter Lady Eleanor received yesterday. They are facts. Yet facts alone are not enough. It is the psychology, always the psychology, that resolves the knot. He glanced once more at the decanter and smiled to himself. And psychology tells me, Inspector, that someone in this house fears me already. It is in the way they breathe when I enter. It is in the way their eyes slide from mine. They have begun the game of evasion, and it is precisely in games that Hercule Poirot excels. The evening shadows lengthened, the little clock chimed again, and the house seemed to draw its breath in silence. The investigation had begun in earnest, but already Poirot sensed the first false lead forming, the temptation to settle too quickly upon one suspect. He, however, was patient. The little grey cells, he knew, must be allowed to work in their own order, sifting each contradiction, each nuance, until the truth emerged with clarity that no one else could see. And somewhere, hidden beneath the polite words and composed faces of Lady Eleanor's circle, the murderer waited, calculating still, believing the crime undetectable. Poirot smiled, the faint smile of a man who has scented the first thread in a tapestry. The game had only just begun. The following morning brought with it a hush of expectancy. In Belgrave Square, curtains twitched discreetly, neighbors wondering whether the scandal would deepen, whether arrests might follow. At number 17, the house of Lady Eleanor stood in sombre dignity, yet within its walls unease flowed like a draught through hidden cracks. Breakfast had been served, though little eaten. The clink of china was subdued, and every footstep echoed in the air of suspicion. Poirot, immaculate as ever in a grey suit with a silk cravat, took his seat at the long dining table, not to partake of food, but to observe. He buttered a roll delicately, yet his attention was fixed not on the bread, but on the faces around him. Margaret Vale sat stiffly, stirring her tea though she had not added sugar. Richard Davenham appeared distracted, scarcely touching his plate, his gaze moving again and again to the unopened post on the sideboard. Vivian Harcourt sipped coffee with exaggerated composure, her hand adorned with rings that caught the light with theatrical sparkle. Dr. Linton unfolded his newspaper with solemn rustling, while Reverend Pritchard bowed his head in brief grace, though his words sounded more perfunctory than devout. When the meal had concluded, Inspector Jameson entered with the brisk air of a man carrying news. His boots clicked on the polished floor, his eyes alight with satisfaction. He held in his hand a small brown envelope. "Poirot," he said, "the laboratory has confirmed it." The residue from Lady Eleanor's glass contained digitalis, enough to kill swiftly. Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Digitalis? Ah, but that is most curious." "Curious?" "It is conclusive," Jameson replied. "Digitalis is a powerful drug, prescribed in precise doses for heart conditions. Lady Eleanor had no such prescription, which means the poison came from outside. And who among this company has access to such a drug?" All eyes turned instinctively to Dr. Linton. The physician's hand, steady a moment ago, faltered on the edge of his newspaper. "You see," Jameson continued, warming to his theme. "The doctor alone could obtain such a substance without difficulty. He admitted prescribing sedatives, convenient cover for poison. And the manner of death, sudden collapse after drinking, fits perfectly with digitalis poisoning. It is clear, Poirot. We have our man." A murmur rose among the guests. Vivian gave a small gasp and pressed a hand to her throat. Richard allowed himself the faintest smile, quickly suppressed. Margaret's eyes darted nervously to the doctor, then away. Reverend Pritchard closed his Bible with a snap, murmuring something about judgment. Dr. Linton, pale but resolute, stood. "This is absurd. Yes, I keep digitalis, as any physician must, but I never prescribed it to Lady Eleanor. She had no need for it. Why would I kill a patient whose health was, for her age, excellent?" "Why indeed?" Jameson demanded. Perhaps because she hinted at disinheriting her family in favor of a hospital wing. A physician stands to benefit greatly if his patient leaves funds for medical institutions. Linton flushed. That is monstrous. I advised her on health, not on finance. Nevertheless, Jameson said, you are the only one here who could have poisoned her so expertly. Poirot, who had listened in silence, set down his butter knife with great care. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost amused. Ah, mon cher inspecteur, you are too quick, too certain. It is true, digitalis is the weapon of the physician, but it is also the weapon of anyone who has read even a modest book of household remedies. You forget it was once a common tincture, derived from foxglove, used in gardens and apothecaries. Access is not so rare as you imagine. Jameson frowned. You defend him? I do not defend, I observe. Let us ask, why digitalis, when there are simpler poisons at hand? Why a substance that so clearly points to the doctor? It is neat, too neat, and neatness, in crime, is suspicious. The doctor looked at Poirot with sudden gratitude, but Poirot raised a saint-ia finger. Do not thank me yet, monsieur, for gratitude may also be misplaced. He rose and requested the company to gather in the drawing-room once more. Reluctantly, they obeyed, forming an uneasy semicircle around the hearth where Lady Eleanor had fallen. Poirot positioned himself at the centre, his small form radiating quiet authority. Let us consider, he began, what we know. Lady Eleanor died from digitalis in her glass. Only her glass, not the decanter, contained it. Therefore, the poison must have been introduced not into the wine at large, but into her particular glass. That glass was distinguished by a gold rim and her initials. Who placed it by her chair? The butler. Who could have reached it unnoticed? Nearly anyone, for all were in and out of the drawing-room before she raised her glass. Richard interjected sharply. But Dr. Linton had both the opportunity and the knowledge. He could have slipped it in at any time while checking on her health. Poirot inclined his head. So he could. And yet, does it strike you not as too obvious? When one leaves footprints in snow, one does not walk in a straight line if one wishes to remain unseen. One wanders, one crosses and recrosses, so that the trail becomes confused. Here, too, I see confusion. For observe, everyone wishes to believe it is the doctor. Why? Because the mind accepts the simple connection, digitalis, doctor. But the criminal, he counts on this simplicity. He arranges it so. Vivienne's eyes widened. Then you mean, someone wished to frame him? Precisely, said Poirot. But let us not leap. We must think carefully. Who knew that suspicion would fall most readily upon the doctor? Who benefited by his disgrace? And above all, who feared Lady Eleanor's announcement last night? The room fell silent. Margaret Vale wrung her hands again, her composure slipping. Richard shifted uneasily. Reverend Pritchard cleared his throat. Poirot's gaze swept over them, lingering on each in turn. He saw the quick flicker of Richard's eyes, the tremor in Margaret's fingers, the slight tightening of Vivienne's mouth, the rigid set of Pritchard's jaw. Each betrayed something. Each had reason. At length, Poirot said quietly, "For the moment, the inspector is satisfied that Dr. Linton is the culprit. It will please him to pursue this path. But for Hercule Poirot, it is too soon. We must allow the little grey cells more nourishment before they pronounce judgment." Jameson bristled. "You mean to obstruct the law?" "I mean only to prevent the law from stumbling over its own haste," Poirot replied. "You may pursue your false lead if you wish, but I tell you now, the truth lies elsewhere." The company was dismissed, but the air was heavy with unease. Dr. Linton withdrew to his room, protesting his innocence under his breath. Richard lingered in the hall, speaking in low tones to Vivienne, who laughed lightly though her eyes betrayed anxiety. Margaret retreated upstairs. pale as paper, while Reverend Pritchard remained in the drawing-room, staring into the cold grate as though he saw judgment written in ashes. Poirot, alone once more, returned to the sideboard. He studied the decanter, the glasses, the faint traces of last night's arrangement. His eyes narrowed. The stopper, yes. It had been touched, replaced, ever so slightly misaligned. He bent, examining the faint arc of polish on the mantel, the circle larger than the clock's base. He whispered softly to himself, "It is coming, the pattern. Soon it will declare itself." The clock chimed the hour, its sound sharp in the stillness. Poirot straightened, his mustaches gleaming in the afternoon light. Somewhere in the house, footsteps echoed down the corridor, quick and furtive. He smiled faintly. The game was unfolding as he expected. The false lead had been set, the police satisfied, but Poirot knew better. The truth, concealed beneath layers of deception, waited for him to uncover it, and he would. For order must be restored, and in Poirot's universe, nothing could remain out of place. The hours that followed Inspector Jameson's declaration brought no relief to the household. If anything, the air grew denser with suspicion, like a storm thickening above the horizon. Servants crept about as if the walls themselves might betray them. The guests, nominally free to retire to their rooms or walk in the garden, moved restlessly through the corridors, unable to shake the sense that every glance was a judgment, every whisper an accusation. Poirot observed it all with the tranquil patience of a chess player who allows his opponent to move first, confident that the final checkmate lies already in his mind. He saw the way Margaret Vale avoided Dr. Linton's gaze, the way Richard watched the inspector with calculating wariness, the way Vivian smiled too brightly as if to cover some inner disquiet. Even Reverend Pritchard, austere and reserved, had begun pacing with uncharacteristic agitation. Inspector Jameson, meanwhile, wasted no time tightening his net around Dr. Linton. He ordered a search of the physician's medical bag, a thorough examination of his room, and inquiries sent to his practice. When Linton protested, Jameson cut him short with the brusque certainty of a man who believes the case closed. "Digitalis," he repeated, "is the doctor's signature. It's a straightforward matter." Poirot, seated in a high-backed chair in the library, merely stroked his mustache. "Straightforward matters," he remarked quietly, "are rarely so." By mid-afternoon, Poirot began what he called his little experiments. They were not formal interrogations, nor questions designed to extract facts. Rather, they were provocations, gentle, almost trivial observations, aimed less at the words than at the responses they stirred. He invited the household once more to the drawing-room, framing his summons as a simple request for conversation. The company assembled reluctantly. Richard lounged by the mantel with his hands in his pockets. Vivian chose a seat near the window, arranging her dress with languid grace. Margaret perched on the edge of a chair, her fingers twined tightly. Dr. Linton stood stiffly by the sideboard, a man wronged and weary. Reverend Pritchard remained near the hearth, clasping his Bible. Poirot began with apparent casualness. "It is curious, is it not?" he said, "how swiftly the shadow of suspicion falls. Yesterday you were companions, bound together by hospitality. Today you eye one another like enemies." No one spoke. Poirot allowed the silence to thicken before turning suddenly to Richard. "Monsieur Davenham, tell me, what did your aunt intend to announce last night?" Richard straightened, startled. "I have no idea." "Ah, but you were telephoned by her in the afternoon. She commanded you to be present, n'est-ce pas?" "Yes, but she gave no details." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "No details. And yet you anticipated humiliation. How could you know unless she hinted at disinheritance?" Richard flushed. She was fond of such threats. It was nothing new. Poirot said nothing further, but noted the defensive tone, the tightening of the young man's jaw. He turned next to Vivienne. "Madame, you quarrelled often with Lady Eleanor. Tell me, if she had chosen to give her fortune to charity, would it not have pleased you? To see her nephew humbled, her grandeur reduced?" Vivienne laughed lightly. "My dear Poirot, I quarrelled with her, yes. But I did not wish her ruined. I enjoyed her company precisely because she was formidable. Without her, society becomes less amusing." Her words were airy, yet Poirot's eyes caught the flicker of something sharper beneath. He let it pass and addressed Margaret. "And you, madame, did Lady Eleanor ever confide her plans to you?" Margaret's lips parted, then closed again. "She spoke often, but vaguely. She said she wished to make things right. I thought—" She broke off, twisting her hands. "I thought she meant the hospital." Poirot leaned forward. "But did you approve? Would you not have feared the change? For 18 years you served her loyally. What if her fortune had passed to strangers? Would you not have been left destitute?" Margaret's composure faltered. "She promised always to provide for me." "A promise," Poirot said softly, "is not a guarantee." Her eyes filled with sudden tears. "I did not kill her," she cried, then sank back, trembling. Poirot offered no reassurance. Instead, he turned with quiet deliberation to Reverend Pritchard. "And you, Monsieur le Pasteur, you speak often of judgment. Did you judge Lady Eleanor worthy of punishment?" Pritchard's eyes flashed. "I judged her soul imperiled. But God's judgment is not mine to carry out. Yet you admit she intended to disinherit her nephew. Would you not have approved such a decision? The money to charity, to the poor. It would have been a victory for your moral crusade." The Reverend's jaw tightened. "If she had done so, I should have welcomed it, but I did not hasten her end. I pray you believe that." Poirot looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering, unhurried, penetrating. He had not accused, not yet. But in their responses, in a flush, a tremor, a too easy laugh, he had gathered the threads of fear. At last, he rose. "You see, mesdames et messieurs, how revealing is the psychology. A simple question, it exposes not facts, but emotions. And emotions, they betray more than facts ever can. I thank you for your patience." The gathering dispersed, but the effect remained. The suspects returned to their rooms uneasy, aware that Poirot had planted seeds of doubt in each of them. Even Inspector Jameson, though still convinced of Linton's guilt, admitted grudgingly that Poirot's methods unsettled them. Later, Poirot walked alone through Lady Eleanor's private sitting room, a chamber lined with photographs and keepsakes of her long life. On the writing desk lay an ivory letter opener, a blotter, and a tray of correspondence. Most of the letters were banal, invitations and appeals for donations. But one envelope, scorched at the edges, caught his eye. The paper had been only half burned, rescued perhaps from the grate before complete destruction. He lifted it delicately. No words remained legible save a fragment of a signature. "On." Poirot smiled faintly. So, the letter that Margaret mentioned was not wholly destroyed, and someone perhaps attempted to hide that fact. He replaced it carefully, his mind turning over the possibilities. That evening, as the household gathered for a restrained supper, Poirot conducted another experiment. He spoke lightly of wills, of legacies, of fortunes lost and gained. He mentioned casually that the solicitor had promised to send over the most recent draft of Lady Eleanor's will by the morrow. Then he watched. Richard paled and looked away. Vivienne raised her brows in surprise. Margaret pressed her lips tightly. The Reverend muttered a prayer. The doctor alone showed no reaction save weary resignation. Poirot noted every flicker, every tightening of the hand, every averted gaze. To him, these were the true clues, more telling than any chemical residue. When supper ended, he lingered by the window, speaking quietly to Jameson. "You see, my friend, how they betray themselves. Each is afraid, not of poison, but of revelation. For Lady Eleanor's announcement concerned them all. It is this truth we must uncover. Jameson muttered that psychology was all very well, but evidence was what mattered. Poirot only smiled. The evidence will come. But first, let the guilty one sweat. Let him or her wonder how much I know. That is the true test. And so Poirot continued his game. He would drop a remark, here, a suggestion there, watching for the telltale flinch. In such ways, he teased out the psychology of guilt as a musician draws melody from silence. By the time night fell, the house had become a place of unquiet dreams. Each suspect lay awake, turning over Poirot's words, fearing that their secret, whether of guilt or merely of resentment, might already be known. And Poirot, alone in his room, polished his moustache before the mirror and murmured with quiet satisfaction, "The murderer is clever, but not clever enough. Already the mask begins to slip. It is only a matter of time." The following morning dawned with a thin drizzle that dulled the grandeur of Belgrave Square. Raindrops slid down the window panes of number 17, tracing patterns like faintly trembling hands. The household woke reluctantly. Sleep had not come easily to those beneath its roof. Each had lain awake, haunted by Poirot's probing questions, fearful of what the new day might reveal. Inspector Jameson, convinced still that Dr. Linton was the culprit, had written to his superiors at Scotland Yard. His report was confident, almost triumphant. Poison found, motive clear, suspect identified. Yet he had not dared move to arrest. Something in Poirot's calm defiance made him hesitate, though he would not admit it. Poirot himself descended to breakfast later than usual, appearing in a perfectly pressed suit of dove grey, a white pocket square folded with mathematical precision. He moved slowly, as though to show that haste was for others. His little grey cells, he felt, required time. Margaret Vale was already at the table, pale and heavy-eyed, her teacup trembling in her hand. Richard Davenham strode in briskly, attempting cheerfulness, but the stiffness of his smile betrayed strain. Vivian Harcourt, wrapped in a silk dressing-gown, spoke animatedly about the dreariness of the weather, though her laugh sounded hollow. Dr. Linton sat grim and silent, while Reverend Pritchard muttered grace under his breath, too low for any to catch the words. The meal passed with an unnatural quiet, broken only by the rattle of cups and the scrape of cutlery. Poirot observed it all as one might observe the movements of actors upon a stage. Every gesture, every silence, was a line in the performance. At 9:30, a knock sounded at the door. Harrison, ever impassive, admitted a clerk from the office of Lady Eleanor's solicitor. The man bore a leather folder, sealed and marked with Lady Eleanor's crest. Within it, he explained, was the most recent draft of her will, sent at Poirot's request. The room grew still as the envelope was placed upon the table. Poirot lifted it delicately, turning it in his hands as if weighing its significance. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked around the table and smiled faintly. "You see, mes amis, here is the truth that Lady Eleanor meant to announce, and already, I think, each of you fears what it may contain. Shall we open it together?" No one spoke. Richard's face had paled. Margaret's hand trembled visibly. Vivian leaned forward with avid curiosity. Pritchard closed his eyes as though in prayer. Only Dr. Linton sat unmoved, as if his fate were already sealed and nothing more could touch him. Poirot slit the seal carefully and drew out the folded pages. He scanned them silently, his expression giving nothing away, then laid them on the table for all to see. The will left the greater part of Lady Eleanor's fortune, her estates, her investments, her personal treasures. Not to Richard Davenham, as long presumed, but to the construction and endowment of the Davenham Hospital wing. Richard was granted a modest annuity, enough for comfort, but not for grandeur. Margaret Vale was left a pension sufficient for her lifetime. Vivian Harcourt received a token bequest of jewellery. Reverend Pritchard, a sum for parish works. Dr. Linton's name was absent entirely. The effect was electric. Richard rose abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. It cannot be true. She would never have done this. But she did, Vivian murmured, her eyes glittering with triumph. Margaret gave a low cry, pressing her hands to her face. Pritchard opened his Bible and began muttering again, though his voice shook with something very like satisfaction. Inspector Jameson seized upon the revelation. There you are, Poirot. Motive clear as daylight. The will disinherited Richard, humiliated him before society. He killed her to prevent the announcement. Poirot regarded the inspector with a mild smile. So? Yesterday it was the doctor. Today it is the nephew. Tomorrow, perhaps, another. Always you change the coat upon the same mannequin, but it is still not the right fit. Richard turned furiously. You must believe me, Poirot. I quarrelled with her, yes, but I did not kill her. My aunt could be cruel, but she was family. Do you think I would stoop to poison? Poirot lifted his hands. I think, monsieur, that you are hot with indignation, but indignation is not proof. Before the argument could continue, a cry rang through the hall. It was Harrison's voice, but stripped of its usual composure. Poirot and the inspector hurried out, the others following close behind. In the small morning room at the rear of the house, Harrison stood frozen, pointing to the writing desk. Upon it lay Margaret Vale, slumped across the blotter, her face ashen, her teacup overturned beside her. A faint, bitter scent hung in the air. Poirot was at her side in an instant, lifting her gently. Her breath was shallow, her lips tinged with blue. He touched the rim of the teacup, brought it briefly to his nose, and set it down with care. She lives, he announced, but only just. Quick, summon a doctor. Ah, no, we have one already. Dr. Linton, your services, if you please. Linton rushed forward, his physician's manner instantly returning. He bent over Margaret, feeling her pulse, examining her pupils. Poison again, he said grimly. The same bitter trace. We must act quickly if she is to recover. Harrison dashed off to fetch hot water and mustard for an emetic. Poirot stood silently, watching the scene unfold, his eyes dark with thought. Another poisoning, Jameson muttered, his face grim. This time the companion. It proves the killer is still among us, and bold enough to strike again. Indeed, Poirot said softly. It changes everything. The murderer seeks to confuse us, to divert suspicion, to silence perhaps one who knows too much, but in doing so, he or she reveals desperation. Desperation is a dangerous guide. It leaves traces. Margaret, under Linton's urgent care, was soon carried upstairs to rest. Her condition was grave, but the doctor believed she might survive if the dose had not been too great. The household, shaken afresh, gathered once more in the drawing-room, their faces pale with fear. Poirot addressed them with quiet gravity. We are no longer in the realm of speculation. Twice now, poison has been used within these walls. The first victim died, the second hovers between life and death. The murderer is among you still, watching us, fearing discovery, striking again to protect himself. I warn you, another attempt may follow, but take courage. Already the little grey cells perceive a pattern. Richard spoke harshly. Then name the killer, Poirot, and be done with it. Poirot shook his head. Non, monsieur, not yet. For the truth must be woven fully, each thread in its place. If I speak too soon, the tapestry will remain incomplete. Patience. The murderer, I promise you, is already caught, but does not yet know it. He looked around the room, his gaze resting briefly on each face, lingering on the faintest flickers of expression. He saw fear, defiance, anger, calculation. Somewhere among them lay the guilty secret, and with this second crime, the secret had begun to crack. Later, Alone with Inspector Jameson, Poirot spoke more plainly. The attack on Margaret Vale was not intended to kill, I think. It was intended to frighten, to silence, perhaps to punish her for something she had said or seen. But to me, it is a confession. Only the guilty, afraid of exposure, strike again. Jameson scowled. So who? Richard, desperate at the will. Vivian, jealous and resentful. The Reverend, self-righteous enough to play executioner. Or do you still defend the doctor? Poirot smiled thinly. I defend no one. But I tell you this, the choice of victim is the clue. Ask yourself, my friend, why Margaret Vale? Why not the doctor himself if he were the threat? Why not Richard, whose anger blazed so openly? No, it was Margaret, the quiet shadow, the one who sees all and says little. That, Inspector, is the murderer's mistake. The drizzle outside deepened into steady rain, pattering against the windows. The house of Lady Eleanor seemed to shrink into itself as if shivering under the weight of its secrets. Poirot stood by the mantel, his silhouette framed by the fire's faint glow, and murmured, "The widow's revenge is not yet complete, but soon, very soon, the curtain will rise on the final act." The rain did not cease all that day. It fell in long silver cords, turning Belgrave Square into a blurred mirror of umbrellas and dripping carriages. Within number 17, the air was close and heavy. Fires had been lit in every grate, but their warmth brought no comfort. Instead, they seemed to emphasize the oppression, the sense of being shut in with fear. Margaret Vale lay upstairs in her chamber, pale and barely conscious, attended by Dr. Linton and a nurse hastily summoned. The house moved with muffled steps. Servants whispered in corners, eyes wide with dread. And through it all, Poirot moved serenely, small and neat like a figure of perfect order set against a background of chaos. Inspector Jameson was less tranquil. He strode about restlessly, demanding facts, evidence, results. 2 poisonings in the same house, Poirot. This is beyond doubt the work of one of them. We must act, arrest someone, before there is a third. Poirot only smiled faintly. Mais oui, there is urgency, but haste is the enemy of truth. The murderer, you see, is clever. He arranges matters so that suspicion falls first one way, then another. To arrest wrongly is to serve him. Let us instead watch how the noose tightens of its own accord. That morning, Poirot asked Harrison, the butler, to bring him the items from Lady Eleanor's writing desk. Among the stationery, the ivory letter opener, and a scattering of bills, lay the fragment of paper Poirot had noticed before. The half-burnt letter. He held it delicately between finger and thumb, studying the blackened edges. Only a corner remained with the faint curve of letters. N. He placed it beneath the lamp, tracing with his eyes the line of the scorch. Someone sought to destroy this, yet not thoroughly. Tell me, Harrison, when you cleaned the grate yesterday, did you see such remains? No, sir, Harrison replied gravely. The ashes were cold by then. I disposed of them myself. This fragment must have been placed back among the papers later. Poirot nodded. Precisement. A clumsy attempt to pretend the letter was gone while keeping it at hand. But why? Jameson frowned. It's meaningless, just a scrap. Poirot's eyes twinkled. There is no scrap without meaning. N. A name, perhaps. Vivian? Adrienne? A clue, mon ami, is like a thread. No matter how small, if you pull it, you unravel the whole garment. He replaced the paper and asked next to see Lady Eleanor's personal effects. Her handbag, her keys, her fan, the spectacles she sometimes wore. Among them was a small notebook, bound in leather, containing lists of charitable donations. Most were ordinary, but in the margin of one page, Poirot found a notation. Settle with R. Final. He showed it to Jameson. Ah, you see. Richard, perhaps, or another. But settle, what did she mean? To forgive, to punish, to pay off? These are the subtleties we must explore. In the afternoon, Poirot requested each suspect to meet him, not in the library this time, but in Lady Eleanor's private sitting room. It was a deliberate choice. He wanted to see them react amid her presence, her things, her lingering authority. Vivienne Harcourt came first, sweeping in with her usual elegance, though her eyes darted nervously about the room. Poirot gestured her to the armchair where Lady Eleanor had often sat. She hesitated, then lowered herself as though afraid the ghost of her rival might object. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said gently, "when you quarrelled with Lady Eleanor, did she ever speak of revenge?" Vivienne laughed, brittle as glass. Eleanor spoke of everything, revenge, triumph, despair, always with drama. She could make a cup of tea into a battle, but I never took her seriously. "And yet," Poirot murmured, "someone took her seriously enough to silence her forever. Would you perhaps have preferred her fortune to go to charity rather than to Richard?" Vivienne's smile flickered. "I might have enjoyed his discomfiture, but kill her. Number, I told you, I liked Eleanor best when she was imperious. She gave society its theatre." Poirot watched her closely. "And the letter burnt yesterday afternoon. You did not see it?" Vivienne's brows lifted. "Number, should I?" He dismissed her then, turning his attention to Reverend Pritchard. The clergyman entered stiffly, eyes downcast, as though reluctant to stand in Lady Eleanor's private sanctum. Poirot placed the burnt fragment before him. "You recognize this?" Pritchard studied it gravely. "It means nothing to me." "No name? Vivienne, perhaps?" He shook his head. "I did not see the letter. Lady Eleanor did not confide in me, save to mock. She told me yesterday that her wealth would serve the poor at last. I commended the intent, though not the spirit." Poirot's eyes glittered. "And yet, monsieur, you are more perturbed than you admit. For if she had announced such a thing, it would have been a triumph for your parish, but she died before she could speak. Tell me, did you fear she might recant?" The Reverend's jaw clenched. "I did not poison her, Monsieur Poirot, if that is what you suggest." Poirot inclined his head. "I suggest nothing, I observe." Merci Richard Davenham followed. He came unwillingly, his step defiant, his face set in angry lines. Poirot motioned him to the desk where Lady Eleanor's notebook lay open. "You see here, monsieur. Settle with R. Fainal. What does this mean?" Richard's colour drained. "I don't know. She made lists constantly. Scribbles, notes. They meant nothing. But this note, made in her own hand, with final underlined. Does it not suggest some confrontation with you?" Richard's voice rose. "We argued, yes. She threatened to disinherit me. But I tell you again, I did not kill her." Poirot's gaze softened. "You fear disgrace more than you fear guilt, monsieur. That is natural, but you must be careful. Anger, it blinds the judgment." When Richard had gone, Poirot was left in thought. He summoned Harrison again, asking about the arrangement of the glasses the previous evening. The butler explained once more, precise and steady. Yet Poirot pressed him on one detail, the alignment of the stopper. Harrison hesitated. "I replaced it myself at 8, sir. Straight, as always." "And afterwards?" "No one touched it, to my knowledge." Poirot said nothing, but his eyes gleamed. For he remembered clearly the faint misalignment, the circle of polish on the mantle larger than the clock's base. Small things, but to Poirot, such small things shouted. By evening, Margaret Vale had improved slightly, able to murmur a few words. Poirot visited her chamber, where she lay propped on pillows, her face wan. She opened her eyes at his approach. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "I saw—" Her voice failed. "You saw what, madame? The truth? Who placed the poison?" Her lips trembled, but no sound came. Then her eyes closed again, and the nurse urged Poirot to leave. He withdrew, thoughtful. Downstairs, the company assembled once more for supper, subdued and wary. Poirot said little, but at one point, as Richard reached for a glass of water, Poirot remarked idly, "It is curious, is it not, how one always reaches for the same glass, though others stand beside it. Habit, it is everything." Richard froze for a moment, then forced a laugh. "We all have habits, Poirot." "Just so," Poirot said softly, "and habits betray us more surely than any witness." That night, as rain pattered steadily, Poirot sat alone by the fire in the library. He reviewed in his mind the fragments, the monogrammed glass, set apart from the rest, the burnt letter carelessly returned, the note in the notebook, "Settle with awe," final, the misaligned stopper, the second attempt at poisoning. Piece by piece they formed a pattern, not complete yet, but close. He murmured to himself, "The murderer plays a game of appearances. He wishes us to see what is obvious, and not what is true. But he forgets. Hercule Poirot does not see as others see. He notices the little things, the trifles, and in them lies the truth." He leaned back, eyes half closed, mustaches gleaming in the firelight. "One more move, and the mask will slip. The little grey cells are ready. Tomorrow, perhaps, the curtain will rise." The rain eased, but did not stop, becoming a fine mist that made the square seem farther away than it was, as if the world had stepped back to watch. Poirot rose early and wrote 3 neat notes. One went to the telephone exchange, asking for the record of any outgoing calls from number 17 between 10 and 10:30 on the night of Lady Eleanor's death. Another to the bank manager, requesting a discreet word on Lady Eleanor's recent instructions and Mr. Richard Davenham's accounts. The third was for the solicitor. Would he be so amiable as to attend that evening? There was, Poirot wrote, the possibility of a codicil of moral importance, if not legal. He sealed the envelopes and gave them to Harrison, who received them with his usual grave efficiency. Before the rest of the household had quite assembled, Poirot walked the drawing-room again, but not as a tourist of tragedy. He measured distances with his eye, the space between the chair by the hearth and the sideboard, the angle at which the French clock faced the room, the position of the decanter and stopper. He moved nothing at first. He merely looked as though the arrangement might confess. Then, with the gentlest touch, he rotated the decanter's stopper a fraction off, true, and shifted the clock 3 degrees to the left. They were changes so small that only a mind enamored of symmetry would take exception. That, precisely, was his purpose. He asked Harrison to have the room set for tea at 4, exactly as it was on the night, if you please. Glasses, wafers, the little plate for almonds, the monogrammed glass placed where Madame sat. When Harrison inclined his head, Poirot added, "No, pardon, I will place the monogrammed glass myself later." The butler's eyelid flickered, but he said nothing. Poirot smiled. "We are both friends of order, you and I. We shall see which of our friends in this house is our equal." By mid-morning, the replies began to arrive. The bank manager, a cautious man whose handwriting looked as if it feared to be misread, informed Poirot that Lady Eleanor had, 2 days prior to her death, transferred a substantial block of securities into trust for the hospital endowment and had directed that no advances should be made against her estate to any private party. Mr. Richard Davenham's request for an extension on a line of credit was declined yesterday afternoon, the letter concluded, by Lady Eleanor's express instruction. Poirot folded the note away without triumph. It was a useful pressure, not a solution. From the telephone exchange came a neatly typed slip. No successful connection was recorded from number 17 between 10 o'clock and 10:30. Several attempts at 10 past 10 ended without answer, it read. Poirot regarded the line a long moment. A man could stand in a hall and lift a receiver and talk to no one at all with convincing animation. It required only a little theatre. The Belgian placed the slip beside the banker's letter and rang for Harrison. "Who saw Mr. Richard at the telephone precisely?" he asked when the butler arrived. "I did, sir, passing along the corridor. He was at the instrument, receiver to his ear. I heard, but forgive me, I heard little of his side of the conversation." "Little?" Harrison's gaze remained level. "He said, 'Yes, hold, yes, yes.' That was all, sir." "In a hall where any word carries," Poirot murmured. "Merci, Harrison. And one more trifling matter. Who dusts the mantle in the drawing-room?" "Lily, sir, under Mrs. Penrith's direction." "Has Lily ever moved the clock?" "Never, sir. Mrs. Penrith is particular. The ornaments are dusted around, not displaced." "Bon," said Poirot softly. "You are released." He found Lily presently in the pantry polishing spoons, with an industry that suggested repentance for some sin she could not name. When he asked very gently whether she had seen any person touch the clock on the evening of the party, she shook her head at once, then hesitated. "Only, well, I wouldn't like to say, sir." "You fear unfairness more than you fear untruth, mademoiselle," said Poirot. "That is admirable. But it is unfair to the dead to leave the truth unknown." She bit her lip. "It was only a minute, sir. I was bringing in more wafers, and I thought I saw Mr. Richard set down his glass on the mantel and put a fingertip to the clock like he was making sure it was straight. I didn't think nothing of it. He always touches things." "He always touches things," Poirot repeated, and the words were like a pin placed exactly at the center of a map. He thanked her and said nothing further. At noon, Dr. Linton reported that Margaret Vale had rallied slightly. She had opened her eyes, tried to speak, then drifted into an exhausted sleep. "If she can be got through the next 12 hours, he said, she will live. But I cannot say when or whether her memory will be serviceable." "Courage," said Poirot. "Let us not ask memory to do the work that observation can accomplish." The house crept toward 4 o'clock. A watery light slanted into the drawing-room and made the gold rim of Lady Eleanor's glass gleam like a coin in shallow water. Poirot, who had purposely placed that monogrammed glass, not at her usual chair, but inconspicuously among the plain ones on the sideboard, came and went in the hours before tea without appearing to watch. Twice he drifted in to consult the little French clock and, with an absent air, left it fractionally crooked. Twice he adjusted the decanter's stopper to his own tiny wrong alignment. It was like setting 2 tripwires across a threshold, invisible to any but the habitual. At 4 precisely the company gathered. Vivian entered first and paused, a small start passing over her face at the sight of the room reproduced as it had been in splendor and terror. She moved to the window and, almost without looking, straightened a cushion whose corner offended her. Richard came next, set his hat on the sideboard, and with the practiced air of a man making a room his own, placed it not where there was space, but where he preferred space to be. Reverend Pritchard took the chair farthest from the hearth. Dr. Linton remained standing, hands behind his back, eyes on the door as though a summons might come at any moment. Harrison entered lastly with the tea, set it down with a composure that could not entirely hide his curiosity, and withdrew. "Mes amis," Poirot said pleasantly, "let us take comfort together. We shall not speak of wills or of poison. We shall speak of trifles, the little civilities that make living together a thing possible." He poured with elegance, offering the cups in a sequence that made no observable sense to anyone but himself. He gave Vivian milk without asking, and was rewarded with a smile of surprised approval. He gave Richard lemon, and the young man accepted without noticing the exchange was out of his ordinary. Presently, the talk loosened. Of the rain, of the idiocy of society columns, of the hospital wing's proposed facade. Vivienne was for Greek, the Reverend for something plainer. Of whether Lady Eleanor had ever truly liked music. Poirot contributed a story about a conductor who insisted on a metronome even for his thoughts. They laughed briefly, as people laugh to prove they can. While they laughed, Richard crossed to the sideboard for more wafers. His hand, almost idly, realigned the decanter stopper. Then, with the same unthinking neatness, he corrected the angle of the French clock by a precise touch to the brass foot. It was done in a second, and with the innocence of habit. Poirot, who had not looked up, noted it. A moment later, Vivian, rising to ring for hot water, passed the sideboard and, though she did not touch the decanter, drew the monogrammed glass out from among the plain ones and set it, without seeming to see what she did, at the corner of the hearthrug where Lady Eleanor's chair had been. "There," she said vaguely as she returned to her seat. "That's better." "Better," Poirot echoed, and his eyes shone. A lover of order is betrayed by order as surely as a liar by a contradiction. He said no more then. It was not the time. But the net he had cast with those trifling misalignments had tightened. The monogrammed glass had found its way to its old place under a hand that claimed not to notice glasses at all. The clock and stopper had been corrected by a man who, by his own account, had no eye for such niceties. These were not proofs for the Crown. They were proofs for Poirot. When Harrison returned with fresh water, Poirot rose and spoke with quiet decision. "At 8 this evening, if you please, everyone will assemble here. I've asked Lady Eleanor's solicitor to attend. There is no codicil." He smiled at Jameson's start. "But there is a moral testament that must be made, and it requires witnesses. Between now and then, I ask that no one leave the house, and that the servants be spared all questions. It is enough for now." Jameson drew him aside as the others drifted out. "You have something," he said under his breath. "By heaven, Poirot, I know that look." "I have many things," said Poirot. "One little thing remains." "The what?" "The why," Poirot answered simply. "The manner I have, the hand I have, the opportunity I have. But the why. I desire that it should be spoken, not by me, but by the one who acted upon it. It is then that justice is neat, you comprehend." In the interval before 8, 2 small events completed the pattern. The first was a second note from the bank, sent with unusual speed. Mr. Richard had, a fortnight ago, endorsed a bill to a firm of dubious respectability. The bill fell due this week. Without a guarantee, his position would be exposed to immediate and noisy consequence. Poirot placed that paper beside the telephone slip. He thought of Richard's practiced hand correcting what did not belong to him to correct, and felt the click of a peace settling. The second was a whisper from the nurse. Margaret had wakened and spoken a single intelligible sentence before sleeping again. "She said," the nurse reported, "Forgive me, sir, if I repeat it poorly." The clock, his hand, only a touch. It frightened her very much to say it. It frightened her because it seemed nothing and was everything. Poirot said, and the last small doubt went out of him as quietly as a candle snuffed between 2 fingers. At 10 minutes to 8, he returned to the drawing-room alone. He restored the clock to its perfect angle, set the decanter stopper truly, and placed Lady Eleanor's monogrammed glass, polished and empty, where it had stood on the night. He stood a moment looking down at the mark the carpet still held like a memory, and at the faint arc of brighter polish just beyond the clock's foot. He imagined a hand, impatient, proprietary, coming to fix what did not require fixing, and with that gesture sealing both a fate and a case. When the first footsteps sounded in the hall, he turned. The solicitor entered, carrying his leather folder like a shield. Behind him came Vivian, with eyes bright and curious, the Reverend with a face set for judgment, Dr. Linton resolute, Harrison grave. Richard came last, late by a minute that announced itself like a habit. They arranged themselves in the room as water finds its level, each to the place the mind prefers. Poirot regarded them with a courtesy that was almost tender. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, and his voice had the calm of a room properly set. "We shall now, if you please, put each object in its place." The The drawing room at number 17 seemed to breathe with its own suspense. The lamps were lit, their soft glow falling upon polished wood and gilt frames. A small fire burned in the grate, not for warmth, but for atmosphere. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, blurring the square into anonymity. Inside, the air was sharp with anticipation. The solicitor sat stiffly by the table, his leather folder unopened. Inspector Jameson loomed by the mantel, restless, his boots squeaking faintly on the parquet. The guests, Vivian, Richard, Dr. Linton, Reverend Pritchard, were scattered as though the mere act of sitting too near one another might betray guilt. Harrison stood discreetly at the door, his expression a mask of professional detachment. Poirot, immaculate in black, his moustaches gleaming in the lamplight, stood by Lady Eleanor's chair. He had arranged the room with exacting care. The monogrammed glass gleamed where it had been placed on the fatal night. The decanter and stopper sat precisely aligned. The French clock faced the room squarely from the mantel. The little Belgian turned slowly, letting his eyes rest on each face, and began to speak. "My friends, we are gathered as once before, in this room where Lady Eleanor fell. Then you looked upon her death with horror. Now you look upon one another with suspicion, and it is right, for among you sits the murderer." A shiver passed through the company. Vivian laughed softly, too brightly. Richard's hand clenched on the arm of his chair. The Reverend muttered a prayer. Dr. Linton's lips compressed into a thin line. Poirot raised a finger, "But do not fear, I will not name the culprit at once. No, we must proceed with order. Order, always. Each piece must be set in its place, each trifling detail observed, until the pattern is complete. Only then can we speak the truth." He began to pace gently, his shoes making the faintest sound on the carpet. "Let us start with the first fact. Lady Eleanor drank from her own glass, the one with the gold rim, her initials upon it. No other glass was touched by poison. Therefore, the murderer chose not to contaminate the decanter, but the glass itself. A choice of cunning, for it reduced risk, but it also narrowed opportunity. Someone must have been near enough to her chair to tamper with it. Inspector Jameson interjected. The doctor had the chance. He moved about freely, checked on her health. "Patience, mon ami," Poirot said mildly. "Yes, doctor." Linton could have done so. He had access to digitalis, knowledge of its use. He seemed the obvious culprit. Too obvious. So obvious, in fact, that it was a trap. The murderer wished us to leap to the conclusion of the doctor's guilt. That is why digitalis was chosen. All eyes turned to Linton, who flushed but held his ground. "I told you so," he muttered. Poirot inclined his head. "Yet we must not absolve him merely because he protests. No, we must weigh each against the scale of psychology. Consider Vivian Harcourt. She quarrelled often with Lady Eleanor, envied her power, disliked her dominance. Yet she also enjoyed her company, her theatre. To kill Lady Eleanor would have robbed Vivian of her favourite stage, and though she straightened a cushion here, moved a glass there, she is not one to poison in silence. Her weapons are words and charm, not the little bottle." Vivienne's smile trembled but did not vanish. Poirot turned. "Reverend Pritchard, you speak always of judgment, of sin and repentance. You would have welcomed Lady Eleanor's bequest to charity, yet to bring about that end by murder? Non. Your righteousness is severe, but it is also sincere. You wished for her soul's redemption, not her swift destruction. You condemned her faults aloud, but your hands are clean of poison." The Reverend bowed his head, though his lips moved in silent protest. Poirot moved to the window, his reflection joining theirs in the darkened glass. Margaret Vale, the faithful companion. Yes, she had reason. If Lady Eleanor altered her will, if her pensions were threatened, her future was uncertain. And yet, what did Margaret do? She wept, she trembled, she feared. She is loyal, too timid for such a bold act. Besides, she herself became a victim. Poison was placed in her cup. Would the murderer strike at his own handmaid? No. She knew too much, and so she was silenced. The room stirred at this, the memory of Margaret's near death still vivid. Poirot spread his hands. So we return to the central figure. Richard Davenham, the nephew, the heir apparent, or rather, the disinherited. For Lady Eleanor had resolved to cut him off, to expose his debts, his squanderings. She had written in her notebook, "Settle with R. Final." She telephoned him, summoned him to hear the announcement. And what did Richard do? He pretended to take a call in the hall, a call the telephone exchange confirms was never completed. He wished to show an alibi to suggest he could not have tampered with the glass, but an alibi so flimsy collapses at once. Richard sprang to his feet. "It's a lie. I did speak. I spoke to my broker, but the line, perhaps it was poor." Poirot's voice cut across him, sharp for the first time. "Non, monsieur. You spoke to the silence. Harrison heard you say yes, hold, yes, but no one answered. You created a play for witnesses. That is not the act of innocence. That is theatre for deception." Jameson's eyes gleamed. "Then we have him. Motive means deception. It all fits." Poirot raised a hand. "Not so quickly. There is more. You see, Richard's motive is clear, but so too was his mistake. The little grey cells, they are offended by disorder. Lady Eleanor loved precision. So too did her murderer, but in another way. The clock on the mantel, the decanter's stopper, the monogrammed glass, all were displaced by the murderer's hand. Tiny adjustments, unconscious, compulsive. The butler never moved them, the maids dusted around them. But twice I misaligned them deliberately. Twice someone corrected them without thought. The silence was absolute. Richard's face drained of colour. Poirot stepped closer, his eyes alight. "Ah, monsieur, you could not endure it. You saw the clock turned and your hand went out at once. You saw the stopper crooked and you made it straight. Habit, you told us. We all have habits. Just so. Your habit of order betrayed you. Lady Eleanor's monogrammed glass, too. You made certain it was at her place. For she must always sit in her throne, must she not? And so, when the moment came, you dropped the poison in the glass that only she would touch." Richard swayed, his hand gripping the chair back. "You twist trifles into accusations. You cannot prove." Poirot's voice softened. "Ah, but trifles. They are everything." Margaret, half conscious, spoke of the clock. His hand. Only a touch. She saw what seemed nothing. But it was everything. A touch upon the clock, a touch upon the glass. "Your hand, monsieur. The hand of the murderer." The solicitor shifted uneasily. "Poirot, these are inferences." Poirot turned swiftly. "Non, monsieur, these are the facts. Lady Eleanor intended to announce her will to disgrace her nephew. He, drowning in debt, chose to act. He sought to frame the doctor, choosing digitalis. He staged a telephone call to divert suspicion, and when Margaret perhaps remembered, he struck again, but clumsily, leaving her alive. It is all of a piece, as orderly as the man himself." Richard's protest died on his lips. His eyes darted desperately about the room as though searching for escape, for sympathy. But Vivian looked away, pale and shaken. The Reverend folded his hands in grim silence. Dr. Linton's gaze was cold. Harrison stood immovable by the door. Inspector Jameson stepped forward. "Richard Davenham, I arrest you for the murder of Lady Eleanor Davenham and the attempted murder of Margaret Vale." Richard gave a cry, half rage, half despair. "She drove me to it. She tormented me, humiliated me, ruined me. Better she die than see me destroyed." Poirot sighed, almost tenderly. "There, you see. The why. Always it comes at the end. Not money alone, but pride wounded, pride desperate. The revenge of a widow, yes, but also the revenge of a nephew denied. Jameson snapped the handcuffs closed. Richard sagged, defeated, his proud shoulders bent. Poirot turned away, his gaze resting once more upon Lady Eleanor's chair. "It is finished," he murmured. "Order is restored. The symmetry of crime and punishment is complete." The arrest had been swift, but the aftermath lingered like smoke after a fire. Scotland Yard men arrived to take Richard Davenham away. He left the house pale, silent, his head bowed, the sound of his boots against the stone steps echoing into the night. A few neighbors, drawn by curiosity, craned from behind curtains as the motorcar pulled away into the mist. Number 17. Belgrave Square stood once more in solemn quiet, but the silence now was different. Not the hush of dread, but the hush after judgment has fallen. Margaret Vale, restored slowly by Dr. Linton's vigilance, remained weak but out of danger. When she learned that Richard had been accused, she shook her head with a sad certainty. "I always feared his temper, Monsieur Poirot. He could never bear not to have his way. It is cruel, but it does not surprise me." Vivienne Harcourt, who had laughed so often at Eleanor's imperious ways, left the house without laughter, her face pale. "How foolish we were," she murmured to Poirot. "We played at quarrels, but she played for higher stakes. I shall not forget her." Reverend Pritchard bowed gravely. "The wages of sin, Monsieur Poirot, are never escaped. I shall pray for his soul, though I cannot excuse his act." Dr. Linton, relieved of suspicion, shook Poirot's hand firmly. "You saved me, sir, from disgrace. I owe you a debt I cannot repay." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "It was not your innocence that saved you, doctor, but your nature. You are not one to kill with secrecy. That I saw at once." When at last the guests had gone and the house quieted, Poirot lingered in the drawing-room with Inspector Jameson. The fire had burned low. The French clock ticked with its officious rhythm. Jameson regarded Poirot with grudging admiration. "You saw what none of us did. A hand on a clock, a stopper turned, a glass placed. I'd have called it nothing. Trifles, as you say." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but it is in trifles that human nature betrays itself. A man may disguise his words, may mask his expressions, but habit is the true confessor. Richard could not resist setting things straight. His order was his undoing." Jameson shook his head. "And the will? That was the spark, wasn't it? Lady Eleanor meant to disinherit him. He feared not poverty, he would have managed somehow, but humiliation. To be exposed before his friends, to lose the family pride, that was unbearable. Pride, mon cher, is often the stronger poison." The inspector gathered his notes. "Well, Poirot, it seems justice is served. The Yard will have its triumph, and you—" Poirot lifted a hand. No, my friend. Not triumph. I do not rejoice in catching a murderer. To me it is always a tragedy. A life lost, another destroyed, and all because of a flaw in human nature. Pride, greed, jealousy. I restore order, yes, but it is order built upon sorrow." For a moment he stood looking at Lady Eleanor's chair, the faint shadow still visible on the carpet. Then he turned away, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous care. "The case is finished. We shall say no more. It is late and Hercule Poirot requires his sleep." He moved toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at the assembled objects. The clock, the decanter, the glass. Each stood now in perfect alignment, immaculate, untroubled. "Order, Inspector," he said softly. "It is always order that guides me, and when order is broken, murder walks in. But happily for us, order can also reveal the murderer. Remember that, and you will have learned a little of the method of Hercule Poirot." With that, he took up his hat, his stick, and departed into the night, leaving number 17 to its silence and its ghosts.